Greetings and welcome to today's talk. I'm Justin Jacobs, professor of history at American University. It's morning time here in Washington, D.C., but wherever it is where you are, morning, afternoon, evening, anywhere in the world, welcome. Today, we are going to talk about the compensations of plunder, how China lost its treasures. What is our goal here? Our goal is to use a series of illustrated talks, discussions. I don't really know if I want to refer to these as lectures, in which I try to supplement the experience of reading this book and understanding the most important arguments, the most important pieces of evidence, the overall scholarly context in which I tried to insert my 15 years of research into this topic and try to illuminate certain aspects of archaeological expeditions that I felt were not adequately addressed in previous scholarship. So I don't really intend these as standalone sort of lectures. Oh, this is, Professor Jacobs this is his argument. This is his illustrated lecture version of his book. This is intended as a supplement. Either you have just read the chapter that we're going to be talking about. Today we're going to cover the introduction. We'll have 5 more of these down the road, in which I'll do one of these for each one of the chapters, chapter 1, chapter 2, chapter 3, and so forth. Either you've just read the chapter and you're coming to here to get sort of a value-added supplementary analysis, or maybe just to help you reinforce some of the ideas that you're starting to grasp, some of the evidence that you saw in passing as you were reading the chapter, and now we're going to reinforce it. Or you are about to read the chapter and you're coming here for sort of a preview of what you're going to see. Either approach can work. Either you've just read it and now we're going to reinforce the ideas that you encountered, or you are about to read the chapter that we're going to discuss, and this will serve as a preview to sort of give you, a signpost. Oh, these are the things that I'm going to be looking out for. I'm already aware of this big theme. Now, when it appears in the chapter, it'll be easier for it to stand out. And one of the other things that I really enjoy, what we're going to be able to do in these sort of illustrated sessions here as well, is that unlike in the book, in which I have a publisher's requirement, you can only include so many illustrations, and so you have to end up very painfully, you have to end up cutting so many photographs and maps and things that you would love to be able to show. That'd be so useful, but you don't have unlimited amounts of images that you're allowed to put into books. So what I can do here also is I can show a lot more of the things that will help us to more richly illustrate the stuff that we're talking about, the people that we're looking at. It's always nice to know what these people look like, what the areas that we're talking about look like, some of the artifacts, what they look like, all of this sort of stuff that we can't necessarily cram into one book. We will be able to do here. And sometimes we can also sort of have the pleasure of seeing the same photographs or images that appear in the book, but now we can do them in color as well. Now, sometimes they're in black and white originally also, but other times they're not. Excuse me. Other times we have many documents and pieces, artifacts and whatnot, in which we do have color photographs, but obviously they had to be turned into black and white in the book. And so we can get a more vivid, vibrant understanding of what these things look like. Really try to make history come alive. I mean, ultimately, that's the whole purpose of this, is to have history come alive. So first off, let's talk a little bit about the origins of this research project. Where did this book come from? How was it conceived? Well, it actually goes way back. It goes way back to when I was in graduate school, some 15 years ago. And originally, my dissertation, my project that I was doing, my first book, Xinjiang and the Modern Chinese State, wasn't about archaeologists whatsoever. It was really an elite, high-level political history in which I wanted to try to understand this northwestern region of Xinjiang, known as New Frontier, New Dominion, New Territories, however you want to translate it in Chinese. We have maps here. You have maps in the book. You're going to be very familiar with Xinjiang by the end of these sessions. I wanted to ask a very simple question. How did the Chinese manage to retain political control over this large, overwhelmingly non-Chinese region? Prior to 1949, when the communists come to power and initiate large-scale Han migration to Xinjiang, prior to that, you probably had 5%, maybe less than that, of the population of Xinjiang was Chinese. Maybe 70% were Uyghurs, Turkic-speaking Muslims who are in sedentary oases and largely deal with agriculture for their livelihood. You had maybe 10-15% Kazakhs. Those are nomadic Turkic-speaking Muslims who mostly live in the northern part of the province, and they're mostly herders. You have a smaller number of Kyrgyz, Mongols, Chinese Muslims known as Hui, some Tajiks. It's quite a mix, quite a cornucopia of different peoples who live in this Nanhan region. And unlike Tibet or Mongolia, the Chinese never lost control, even for a moment, of Xinjiang during the 20th century. So for me, it was a really fascinating place to sort of do my original dissertation research on. I was trying to understand, how did they manage to keep this? Because they did lose Tibet for a long time. They permanently lost Outer Mongolia, which they had previously had during the Qing Empire before. So I thought, wow, here is the only majority Nanhan region that was continuously held by Chinese rulers throughout the 20th century. What a great case study to try to understand from the Chinese perspective the problems that they faced, the issues they had to deal with in order to keep hold of Xinjiang. So as I'm doing this research, not related to archaeology, I'm looking for sources. How do I get ground level perspectives to help supplement the elite Chinese perspective of how they maintain their political rule? And I realized that a lot of the Chinese documents, the Chinese sources, don't really address or record impressions of the local Uyghurs and Kazakhs on sort of the ground level, the lower classes. How am I going to get some of their voices, perhaps? Eyewitness observations on the ground, not just what the Chinese governors and officials were seeing. And I realized, hey, wasn't Xinjiang a region where there were a lot of foreign expeditions, archaeological expeditions? I was aware that men like Sven Hedin, who you're seeing here, Orlstein, Paul Paleo, I knew they had passed through this region in the early 20th century. I thought, might it be worth looking at their diaries or publications to see if they can, sort of have some incidental eyewitness accounts of what they were seeing that might supplement my political narrative from the elites. So I started looking at men like Orlstein, men like Sven Hedin, who wrote lots of books. They had a lot of published materials and a lot of unpublished materials. And I went to them to see not what they were saying about archaeology, about the artifacts that they were removing from northwestern China. I wanted to understand what they were saying about their meetings with Chinese officials, passing through different oases. What is the sort of opinion of the Uyghurs towards the Chinese rulers? That sort of stuff. And here you're seeing this wonderful photograph that I uncovered for my first book, in which the Swedish explorer Sven Hedin is meeting with one of the warlords who was in power during the 1930s, from 1933 to 1944. Sheng Shicai was the military governor of Xinjiang, and Sven Hedin met him. But I also realized that prior to that, many other archaeologists had met different Chinese rulers who were in power at different time periods. And so I started looking at some of these diaries, just sort of casually, not expecting really to find much, but I thought, well, I got to cover my bases and check out this source base just to make sure that I know if there is or is not anything significant. And I was surprised. Here's Orlstein. By far, he is the most famous, and his materials, the documents that he kept, the records he kept from his expeditions were the most voluminous and the most accessible. The vast majority of them are held at the Bodleian Library in Oxford University. Very easy for researchers to get a hold of. He saved almost everything, and he took a lot of stuff out from China. Over three decades, from 1900 to 1930, he undertakes 4 different expeditions. So it spans the late Qing dynasty, it spans the early years right after the 19 Revolution, and then it gets into 1930 when you have Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government rising to power in the southern capital of Nanjing. And I thought, well, Orlstein's going to be the best sort of case study through which to frame, this new research project as it came to light. What came to light? What did I find in Orlstein's papers? Well, here are pages from his field diary, give you a sense of what you're looking at here. This is always a surreal experience for the researcher. It's very exciting. It's one of the few times that boring scholars actually do get an adrenaline rush and feel this sort of the prickly skin when you're doing something. You're flipping through things, just historical documents, and the people you're studying touch these things. It's sort of like the celebrity connection, but sometimes there would be sand that would, grains of sand that would fall out from the pages, dried flowers that were pressed between the pages, and it's still here. And I'm thinking, my God, it's over 100 years later, and the sand from the Taklamakan Desert is still here, is still on this diary. So anyways, I'm reading through these to try to get some more political insights into the early 20th century in Xinjiang. And incidentally, I started reading some accounts of his interactions with both elite Chinese officials and the majority Muslim people that he mostly interacted with on a daily basis. The people he hired for labor, the local Muslim gentry, perhaps, who were wealthy merchants, and he would stay at their house sometimes, have relations with them. And then when he met with the Chinese officials, and I was surprised. I thought these accounts are so positive, or at least they're not unpleasant and as negative as I expected. Isn't Stein, after all, an agent of imperialist exploitation? Right? I've always grown up hearing about him being referred to as a thief, all of these guys as thieves who stole the cultural heritage of China. So when I went back to their diaries, I expected to see more acrimony in the pages that, oh, I met with so-and-so and he gave me the cold shoulder, or he really does not approve of me going out into the desert and taking these things away. He was very covetous of what I brought back and tried to get it from me, tried to sort of appropriate it from me. I didn't see any of that whatsoever. And so I'm a little surprised here, and I'm like, this seems surprisingly pleasant, positive, these interactions that he's describing. However, these are his descriptions, okay? So you have to take that with a grain of salt and say, okay, maybe he's biased. Maybe this is revealing of his agenda. But if I go into sort of, let's say, the Chinese language source base, I'm going to get a totally different perspective. And they're going to say, obviously, among themselves, this guy's a thief, right? The Chinese source base is going to be very, very different, isn't it? Also in the Bodleian Library, and then in later years, I was able to accumulate more and more of this stuff. I was able to find a significant amount of Chinese archival material relating to these expeditions. And, I was assuming that the Chinese sources would reveal that Stein is engaged in elaborate self-delusion, self-deception, and that they're criticizing him behind his back. But I found the complete opposite. If anything, the Chinese source space was more positive in their impressions and judgments of Stein than Stein was himself about what he was doing. Right? This was shocking. And this is when I was starting to realize maybe there's a research project here that I need to delve into more deeply. And so you can see I was able to find out that there was this disconnect between the early years of his expeditions and then his last expedition in 1930. When he first comes in 1900 and 1906 for his first two expeditions, he gets one sort of a reception. And then by 1930, when he comes back, he has a very different reception. And I thought, we need to account for this. Here you can see, here he is in 1915 with Aksu magistrate Zhu Reicher. He's seated there in the center. Stein obviously is on the right. Stein met Zhu Reicher on 3 of his 4 expeditions. The only one he didn't meet him on is the very first one, 1900. Zhu Reicher ended up, I realized that Stein had actually retained private letters written from Zhu Reicher to Stein. Here is one from the 1908 visit. I know you see this. This one is reproduced in the book, but it's in very dark black and white. Here you can see, oh, the stationery is red, very vibrant red. You can actually see it reflecting off my skin right here. It's so red. Yes, so the Chinese officials very often use bright red stationery when they were writing letters. This is Zhu Reicher's personal letter to Stein after his second expedition. I'm going to assume most of you probably don't read Chinese, but let me just give you a little sense here of what we're seeing with this line right here. Dear sir, your footsteps everywhere they go becomes famous, or everywhere you set your foot becomes famous because you were there. And he's saying, that you add luster to the sands of the Gobi Desert and shine a light on the peaks of the Kunlun Mountains. The whole letter is like this. It is this over-the-top purple prose, gushing praise for Stein. Now you have to assume there's probably a little bit of exaggeration here. There's a little bit of flattery. So just like with Stein sources, you can't take these completely at face value. You need to accumulate as many sources as you possibly can and start comparing them with one another, and then come to this more sober conclusion. All right, this is probably what they really thought of each other. Nevertheless, I'm not seeing anything negative here, no kernel of doubt whatsoever that would perhaps contradict what I'm seeing in Stein's materials, in which I'm saying, okay, he thinks he's awesome, but the Chinese officials are toning it down a little bit. And you can see a little kernel of criticism. No, not at all. And then you get this in 1930. This is the English language statement, there was a Chinese as well, regarding Sir Orlstein's archaeological expedition in Chinese Turkestan. I quote from this in the book at several times as well in this introductory chapter. And they're basically calling him a thief who is engaged in commercial vandalism. Okay, and he ends up being obstructed on this fourth and final expedition. So how do we get from this, all right, chummy pals hanging out together, writing fawning letters of praise back and forth, to this? You, sir, are a thief, and we are doing everything we can to kick you out of China. This is the view that we've inherited today. It's from 1930. It's the later view. So I started asking myself, all right, what's going on here? Something changed. First of all, the initial interactions, the initial basis upon which the early expeditions were undertaken, we don't understand it, because I'm totally shocked by what I'm finding in both the English language source base and the Chinese language source base. And these are unpublished things. Stein's unpublished diaries, the Chinese unpublished letters. See, unpublished matters because there's less of a filter than there is when you self-censor for a public audience. When you know it's going to be read widely, you write differently than you will in a more private context. All right. So that original basis, something's very different. We don't understand what's going on here because this makes no sense. There's no evidence that anyone thinks he's a thief or doing anything immoral. By 1930, of course, it's completely changed. And this is more familiar. All right, we understand this. This is the discourse of cultural sovereignty. All this stuff belongs to the Chinese nation. Anyone who removes it is a thief. All right, we understand that because that's the discourse that we've grown up with and we've imbibed. All throughout the world, in whatever country you may have been raised in, every country has what we refer to as a nationalist interpretation of the value of the material remains of your nation's heritage. Okay, so my conclusion here is that what I assumed about how the expeditions were conducted and what the locals thought about the Western archaeologists was very wrong. Okay, there's big research questions that remain unanswered, and I did not see anyone else addressing these. I read all the books on archaeology, archaeological expeditions around the world, the Middle East, Egypt, Iran, Machu Picchu, everything I could consume. I was reading, thinking, someone's going to address this. Someone's going to answer the question of why it seems like in the early years, the Western archaeologists were embraced and welcomed for the most part. And, this is why they were so successful. I did not see anyone addressing this. And even for this project, I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to go on and do my dissertation. I'm going to do the political history of Xinjiang. Someone else is going to do this project. All right. This is someone, a cultural historian. They will do this and I'll leave it to them. And I'll look forward to reading their book. 5 years later, 10 years later, I'm realizing no one's doing this. Why is no one doing this? Because I kept stumbling upon new important source bases, archival collections, Chinese documentation. The Chinese archives in mainland China would keep publishing stuff, their own archives, and I'd get a hold of it and say, oh my God, this is blockbuster. Anyone going to work on this? No one's working on it. So I thought, okay, fine, this will be my next project. After I get the first book done, I'm going to go and really dive into this because something's going on here and I can't explain what's going on yet. All right. Now, all right, let's move beyond this and sort of, trace the trace, the layout of the chapter itself. And let's begin with the ideological context of the Silk Road expeditions through Xinjiang, through northwestern China from roughly 1900 to 1930. At least those are the decades when Stein is most active. All right, let's place them in their proper context. All right, we know that at this time period, we're going to see, or we should expect to see, the same racist narratives about their preferred version of what Western civilization is, who's included in Western civilization, who's not, how that definition changes over time. All right, those same racist narratives that we're so familiar with are also operating here, but even more so because this is fairly late in the game. The China expeditions, or just in general, the exodus of cultural treasures from China happens much later than elsewhere in the world because the Westerners arrive much later. You have Giovanni Belzoni in 1815 going through Egypt, Napoleon in 1798 invading Egypt and taking stuff away. That's 100 years before we start seeing the same stuff in China. Okay, so by this point, the turn of the 20th century, social Darwinism is in full swing. It's in full bloom. All right. All these guys are going in and they've been reared on the idea that there are different races throughout the world. These races have evolved differently. And they've evolved to the point where some races are just genetically superior to other races, which are genetically inferior. And there would be different causes that were attributed to this inferiority or superiority, but the end result was the same. We are the superior race. And they would infuse this agenda backwards into history, into their own research. One of the ways they did it was through anthropometry. Closely related to the science of phrenology, basically measuring bone structure, physical appearance, usually of the head, to try to determine your capability or incapability for building civilization, or not building civilization. And they would often trace superior civilizations or evidence of ancient superior civilizations to somehow being connected to white people, Western Europeans. And that was usually done through what was sort of imagined to be the Aryan race, the Indo-European speaking peoples. And they would oftentimes in Central Asia, Northern India, these parts of the world, they were very fond of going in and taking anthropometrical measurements of local people and saying, we see some ancient evidence of Greeks. This must be, their ancestors must have intermixed with Alexander the Great's people, and therefore this is a slightly superior race. And you can see this in their architecture and whatnot. This is more superior than the other tribe in the valley, 10 miles that way, in which we see no evidence of a Greek nose, and therefore that explains why they seem poorer and less sophisticated than this particular tribe. All right. One of the things that we see in this chapter, and we will see throughout the book, is a man named Ellsworth Huntington. There he is. I didn't have enough images to include his image in the book. There's Ellsworth Huntington, a climatologist from Yale. And he published the book in 1915 called Civilization and Climate. And he went to Xinjiang in 1905, 1906, the expedition that we're discussing in this book, or that appears throughout in this book. He went there in order to collect evidence, on-site research materials for his thesis that would eventually be included in this book. He went everywhere in the world to collect evidence for his thesis. What was his thesis? In Civilization and Climate, the book eventually published in 1915 and hugely popular for the first half of the 20th century, often used as a textbook in high schools. It was basically, he said that, yes, different races have evolved differently, largely on the base of climate. His thesis was that it was on climate. Other people would have different proposals for why races had evolved differently, and some were superior and inferior. His was very influential because it kind of gave the appearance of being impartial. I'm not a racist that you're just sort of born differently for no reason whatsoever, and that's why you find yourself, the descendant of slaves. He says, I've got a sophisticated academic theory that's based on climate. Nothing you could have done about it. The people who happen to benefit from the best climatic conditions, usually somewhat colder, temperate regions of the world, the northern hemisphere and whatnot, these were conducive to fostering the evolution of superior races. And so, it's not really we didn't really do it on purpose. We just sort of incidentally benefited from it. And it's not your fault that you're an inferior race. So you could see there was some appeal to this because it had the appearance of scientific impartiality. I'm sorry, this is what the evidence says. But it still justified the status quo and the imbalance of power. Still justified men like Huntington monopolizing, power and wealth in his world, and having a sophisticated academic theory for saying why you're at the bottom and I'm at the top, and it's not going to change. He was very clear about this in his book. He would say things like, the white people and the black race, they differ from each other, just like the apple and the plum differ, and no amount of education can eradicate the unbridgeable gap between them. Right? And this was widely embraced at the time. All right, this guy was very, very influential. So when you see him, we don't really talk about this that much in the book, because when I look at his letters and materials, I'm looking more at how he's talking about the economic basis of these expeditions, as we'll see in chapter 1, Sahibs in the Desert. But always remember, whenever you see Ellsworth Huntington, blah, 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 he's in Xinjiang to collect evidence for this theory that explains why some races are superior and why some are inferior. Now, he wasn't the only one. Men like Stein fully embraced these ideas, and we see quotes from him in his letters in the introduction as well, in which Stein is regurgitating these very influential ideas and saying, "I completely agree with you that the Indians, the people of India, are not to blame for their degraded status in the world today. They can't help it that they suffered from the effects of an inferior climate. Nevertheless, the end result is the same, and it justifies the British, white people, being in charge in India and the Indians needing to learn from us over a long period of tutelage before they could ever even conceive of being independent, because they have to battle against millennia of negative effects from the climate of South Asia." All right, so Stein, all these guys fully embraced these sorts of ideas. One of my favorite examples comes from Albert von Lecoq, another guy whose picture I couldn't fit into the book. You'll recognize the image from the bottom right, but probably not from the upper left here. Albert von Lecoq, we have a wonderful example from him in which he too is thinking in terms of superior races, inferior races, what is superior, the Greeks, the Romans, anything that can be connected to classical interpretations of Western civilization. Here you have on the bottom right from his book in German, in which he describes this Buddhist torso from a village nearby Turfan. He describes it very famously as what does he say? The drapery or the robes fall in noble lines, not yet degraded by Eastern Asiatic misunderstandings of classical forms. Any deviation from what Greek sculpture should look like is a misunderstanding. It can't be cultural adaptation, cultural syncretism, merging with other traditions. It's a misunderstanding. It is a degradation. It is a fall from classical perfection. And that's what we see when the superior Greek race mixes with inferior Eastern Asiatic races. In this chapter, we also see sort of the casual, racist, and bestial language that is often used very casually to describe the local people. At one point, we have Stein's friend Karl Keller talking about the Chinese people, reminding him of worms. A big can of worm. What earthly use is there for a country to have as many people as we see in China? They remind me of a huge mass of disgusting worms. Stein will refer to his Muslim courier, the guy who delivers mail for him. He's loyal like a dog. No matter how far the distance is, he's like a dog. He'll do it. It's meant as a compliment, but today we see it as a backhanded insult as well. He's referring to him as a dog, as something less than human. This sort of language was often casually deployed to describe anyone who did not have white skin. Now, the Nazis are the most famous. This is actually a photograph of the Nazi expedition to Tibet in 1938 to 1939. They're the most famous embodiment of these racist ideas and theories. But what most people don't realize, by sort of piling on the Nazis and always condemning them, it's sort of they're being scapegoated to a certain degree, as they're the ones who really believed in all this. And of course, the Holocaust demonstrates their racist theories and all that. That's true, but don't forget that they're only more guilty by degree. It's not as though the Nazis were the only people who thought of different races in this way and believed that some were vastly inferior and superior and not even worthy of being on this earth anymore. Most of the Western archaeologists who came from different non-German countries subscribed to the exact same theories. Okay? So, the Nazis are only guilty by more degree. All of the Western archaeologists are products of their time. They're products of their time, and they subscribe to these same ideas. Now, we also know that there are hidden strategic agendas in all of these expeditions. We know that Stein, there he is here, mapping the land with his dog Dash sitting next to him. He had many dogs named Dash. Many of them ended up dying. He had to replace it. He always replaced it with a very similar dog, also named Dash, and just added another Roman numeral after it: -2, -3, -4, I think there may have been 6 total, 6 dashes. We know that they would map these lands and bring back enormous amounts of cartographic data that they would then hand over to military authorities when they got home. This is a terrible image. It's the only one I was able to find of Gustav Mannerheim. You'll see Gustav Mannerheim quoted from his diary. He accompanied the Frenchman Paul Pelliot. They were on the same expedition before they had a falling out with each other and went their separate ways. But we have two separate diaries from that exact same expedition. Stein's diaries obviously talk about the secret mapping that he's carrying out all the time. We know that local officials, this is actually one of the few things that they would refuse the archaeologists at the time, was if they learned that they wanted to openly go out and survey, make maps of strategic military installations, or what they perceived as sensitive strategic military installations, and they would stop them. If you did not come up with a suitable benign pretext, we have Screen, Claremont Screen. I don't have a good picture of him, but this is the book that he wrote about his time as consul at the British consulate in Kashgar, 1922 to 1924, I believe he was there, in which one time he says, I told the Chinese officials that I want to go up to hunt ibex in the mountains. And he says, not a soul here believes me that I'm actually doing that. They all take it for granted that I am surveying the Russian frontier. So the Chinese officials were not dupes. They knew that this strategic military mapping was going on at the same time that archaeological expeditions were going on. And if you did not come up with a suitable benign pretext, like I'm going to shoot ibex, you will be refused. Stein was refused. We have this wonderful evidence on his first or second expedition in which he asked for permission to go up to the ramparts of a local military fortress to take theodolite observations. See, it sounds all scientific, and maybe this one was benign, but the local military official said, no, you cannot go on to the ramparts of this fortress. That is a sensitive strategic military site. And Stein, because he did not come up with a benign pretext, is ultimately rejected. And that is one of the few times that we will see a refusal from local authorities, is when you openly say you want to go do mapping and you can't sort of hide it with, oh, I'm just going hunting for ibex. They will refuse you permission to do that. Also remember, while we're looking at Screen's book right here, the role of consuls. Consuls were the local political agent, the extension, the political embodiment of the empire, and they were the ones who facilitate archaeological expeditions, not just in northwestern China, in Kashgar, but we also saw this with Belzoni in Egypt in his expedition in 1815. He works with the British consul Henry Salt in Cairo. You cannot undertake a archaeological expedition unless you have a consul in that country who will help liaison with local political authorities on your behalf. Now, here's Xinjiang. Why map Xinjiang? Or why map any part of the non-Western world? Didn't you come here for archaeology? Well, you never know when future political conditions may make this land available for incorporation into your empire. Oftentimes, archaeological expeditions are going into remote frontier areas where political control from the host empire is not all that firm. You're not usually going into the heartland of these countries. You're going into remote areas where you're likely to find ruins just lying around because there aren't many people living there either. And so, these are lands where you could conceivably imagine in the future, if there's political instability in the host empire, this land could become available for a new empire to incorporate into their jurisdiction. And so these maps were always handed over into the hands of the military authorities of the sponsoring empire of the expedition when they got home. Xinjiang, right along with Afghanistan. Here's Afghanistan, the arm of Afghanistan reaching over to Xinjiang. If you go over here, Afghanistan would be right over here. Afghanistan was the most likely candidate that both the Russians and the British, and their sort of what's known as the Great Game in the late 19th and early 20th century, that was the most likely candidate that the Russians and British thought might become available one day, and one of those two empires might have to seize it. So they're always trying to get sensitive information about Afghanistan's terrain. Xinjiang was probably the second most likely. Xinjiang was the land that was second most likely for the Russians and the British to think, hey, this had recent Muslim uprisings against the Chinese in recent memory. Yes, the Chinese managed to restore control, but who knows? Xinjiang could very well fall out of the Chinese grip in the near future, and we want to be ready to come in and perhaps take over it if that happens. Claremont Screen, the British consul in Kashgar, I have that wonderful quote from him in which he says, who knows? God, Governor of British Turkestan. What a glorious title that would be. He's joking around, but he's thinking about it. Maybe there'll be a British British Turkestan, not just a Chinese Turkestan. We will take over Xinjiang, and it'll be British Turkestan, and I'll be the governor. All right, we need to think about these expeditions in that political context, that they also have subtle political motives that oftentimes are on the back burner. But everyone knows in the future, this could be useful strategic data. Now, the logistics of an expedition. Stein admitted that many times, it was openly admitted this, he couldn't do an expedition without the active support of Chinese officials in Xinjiang. So, if that's the case, if even he admitted that, why did the Chinese officials give him that support? See, the previous explanations, when I got into this project and I was thinking, all right, what have people said about this? What do most scholars say is the reason for the cultural exodus of treasures, not just from China, but from all over the world? How did it happen? And I started realizing that there are three major elements to prior explanations: coercion, corruption, and deceit. Both Chinese scholars, or non-Western scholars, and Western scholars invoke these explanations. So I said, okay, if these are the explanations, I'm going to look for evidence of this. And if I find evidence of this, then problem solved. There's no research project here, because that's what people have always been saying for the past 100 years. Corruption, deception, and coercion. So I went looking for examples of these three motivations in all the news sources I was finding. Did anyone help Stein as a result of coercion, corruption, or deceit? Now, how do you interrogate such a research question? How do you pursue and answer such a research question? It's one thing to ask a question. It's another thing to have evidence where you can actually say, I think I've answered it convincingly with new evidence and data or interpretations of old data. Well, I started with coercion. Okay, here are the American soldiers in the Forbidden City in 1900 during the Boxer War. Westerners clearly had military superiority and political privileges in China and throughout the rest of the non-Western world. So, did the Chinese help Stein due to the threat of a military invasion? If they didn't, what can Stein's diplomatic papers reveal? Here is a wonderful, this is the same passport image that you have in the book, but here you can see it in all its glorious color with the various ink, both the purple stamps and the red circles all around it. What can Stein's diplomatic papers reveal? Here we have Stein's passport for his second expedition from 1906 to 1908. Note what I refer to as underlined passages. The old Chinese way of underlining a passage is little red circles next to the characters. Here are the red circles. Paul Paleo's passport has the exact same circles. This is what this means is a local official added these. Stein came into his jurisdiction. The local official says, I need to see your passport. Issued by the government in Beijing, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Beijing. Stein pulls it out, unfolds it. The guy looks at it and says, all right, what's important for me to note? Blah, 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 blah. Oh, right here. Okay, this is important. I need to make sure I pay attention to that. And he's circling them. What does this say? When Stein enters into your jurisdiction, immediately inspect and release his inspect his luggage and inspect him, process him, and release him. And then, in accordance with the treaties, protect him and do not throw obstacles in his way. If you do not do this, it'll be cause for investigation. Okay? As I say in the book, this is scary language. No wonder the local official underlined this. He's basically saying, okay, I'm not to obstruct Stein. Okay, I need to observe the treaties, which give him extraterritoriality and certain privileges. I don't want an incident with the British by seeing any sort of harm befall Oral Stein or any of the foreign explorers. Okay, then we have men like Zhu Reicher. Oh, we saw him before writing that sugary letter to Stein. We also have other Chinese documentation that I uncovered in the Chinese archives having nothing to do with Western archaeologists, in which Zhu Reicher basically says that the consulates, the Russian consulate, the British consulate in Kashgar, he says they call them consulates in name, but in reality, they are a base from which an economic monopoly is forcibly imposed on our territory. All right, a very dim view of Western consulates. They're not just there for processing benign paperwork related to British and Russian expatriates who are conducting business. It says these are economic infiltration units that attempt to meddle in Chinese internal affairs. And everyone knows when the archaeologist shows up to do his expedition, he stays at the consulate. He works with the consul. And the consul is in communication with local Chinese officials to facilitate Stein and Paleo's and all of their expeditions. Okay, so clearly you can see that Zhu Reicher has two things going on here. He's admiring Stein on the one hand, having a personal relationship with him, and on the other hand, he's acknowledging consulates of with which Stein is closely associated are embodiments of Western exploitation and imperialism. Okay. And then we have Paul Paleo. There he is, looking very dapper. Paul Paleo, who does his famous expedition in 1906 to 1908, same time as Stein's second expedition. Paleo, when he gave a lecture in Paris upon his return in 1909, he said, still for all the best efforts of Europeans, we are still a liability to the local Chinese official when we pass through their jurisdiction, and when we leave their jurisdiction, the local Chinese official breathes a sigh of relief. Phew! No incidents occurred on my watch. I'm not going to get in trouble because no harm befell the foreign explorer. So it does sound like Chinese officials were afraid of the prospect of Western military power and intervention. But does it follow from that observation that they were coerced into lending assistance to an archaeological expedition? Okay. Remember, those underlines, the circles on Stein's passport, would have been added by one of the same officials who wrote those gushing letters to Stein. It could have been Drew Racher. Okay? And these letters were not just written to Stein. The Chinese officials said similar things to each other with no expectation that Stein would ever read it, even when they're among each other and writing to each other and talking about Western archaeologists. They're saying the same things about them. What I have here, what are you looking at here? This is the postface written after. The postface added to a Chinese translation of Oral Stein's preliminary report of his first expedition. He published that in English in 1901. Sent a copy to the British consulate, George McCartney, in Kashgar. That then was sent on to the Chinese governor in the capital of Urumqi, a man by the name of Rao Yingqi. Governor Rao says, I want to know what Stein's been up to in my province. Let's commission a Chinese translation of this English language report of what he was doing. A man by the name of Wan Rong, there's his name right there, Wan Rong, translates this from English to Chinese. And this is his postface, in which it's not just his translation of Stein's own words, he adds his own comments about Stein. And I quote from this in the book at length. This was a wonderful resource discovered by Professor Imre Galambos at the University of Cambridge. He actually discovered this obscure translation of Stein's first report, and it's invaluable because it tells us what Chinese officials thought about Stein in 1902 among each other with no expectation whatsoever that Stein would have read this. So they're not self-censoring, they're not trying to flatter him to get some reward, put in a good word about me, nothing like that at all. In the book, we draw from this extensively. He is a refined and cultivated gentleman. We should be imitating him. Really positive assessments of Stein. No sense that what he's doing is morally dubious, that he's a thief. No sense that we're being coerced into helping his expedition because if we don't, they're going to invade us. No. I'm not going to translate the whole thing here, but this is gushing praise for Stein in 1902, when Chinese are talking to themselves. If anything, they're saying he's a scientific celebrity on Camelback. Imitate him, because we want to be just like him. He's very, very admirable. All right. So our more nuanced conclusion right off the bat here then, from just a brief survey of some of the materials, is that it doesn't have to be an either-or proposition. It can be both. Human beings are complex. We can have multiple ideas and modes of interaction with other people that we don't necessarily see as contradictory. We all do this. We interact with our parents in one way, we interact with our friends another way, we interact with our spouse another way, we interact with our kids another way, we interact with our neighbor another way. Each mode is distinct. And that's not a problem. Right? People's motivations can be complex as well. They can think that Stein comes from an empire that is generally exploiting and bullying our empire, while at the same time admiring and embracing Stein on a personal level and thinking that we want to imitate him and I want to be friends with him. And he's doing a wonderful, glorious job in bringing back all of these artifacts from obscurity and studying them for the benefit of the world. Those are not incompatible sentiments. You can hold both those sentiments in your mind at the same time. And I think they are. Now, coercion. Let's talk about coercion. Afghanistan. Here's Afghanistan. We've already been talking about the threat of a military invasion. Did they help Stein and Paleo and Hedin? Were they allowed in because they were afraid if we don't say yes, if we don't allow them to come into our province to do an archaeological expedition, they're going to invade China? Just like that instance of the Americans and the other seven empires invading Beijing and the Forbidden City in 1900. Well, that was a rare instance of military plunder. All right, as we've talked about before, that's rare. That's very rare. More often than not, archaeological expeditions do not come in behind the barrel of a gun. And as we'll see, they aren't kicked out by the barrel of a gun when they're finally encounter obstruction in the 1920s and the 1930s. One of my favorite examples of this, sort of the ultimate litmus test, was it about coercion? Are they afraid if we don't say yes? We believe that this is theft. We believe that he should not be doing this. It's morally dubious, but we have no choice because they're stronger than us and they're going to blow us away with their superior guns and armies if we don't let them in. Is that what's going on here? One of my favorite examples is the state of Afghanistan, nestled in between the Russian and British empires. All right, beasts, huge imperial beasts on either side. Afghanistan, the emir of Afghanistan, by the early 20th century, had already ceded most of his foreign affairs to the British. Even though Afghanistan is nominally independent, he has given the British the right to represent them in foreign affairs. Okay, Stein continually wanted to go to Afghanistan. He thought the best material traces of Alexander the Great and the Greeks he so admired were going to be found in Afghanistan, not Xinjiang. Xinjiang was always a backup plan. Every time Stein goes to Xinjiang, it's because his original plans to go to Afghanistan failed. So Xinjiang was the backup. Every time. That's why he never really learned Chinese all that great, because he always thought he was going to go to Afghanistan. And then he's like, oh, I guess so. My backup plan will be Xinjiang again. So he never really got Chinese down because he didn't anticipate going back there. Each time he left Xinjiang, he thought, this is the last time I'm going to be here. He never expected that he would be returning. He says, eventually Afghanistan's going to become available. It never became available. The emir of Afghanistan continually said no. Right? Let that sink in. Afghanistan, infinitely smaller and weaker and less resourceful than China. Okay, at the exact same time period, felt free to tell Stein no. Not once, not twice, not three times, over and over and over again. They said no. And the British could do nothing about it. That's one of your best and clearest illustrations, is that you could say no. What are the consequences of saying no? Well, they might denigrate you as anti-scientific and not modern. You're backward, and you get a long ways to go before you're going to join the civilized nations of the world. But these are words, not bullets. Okay? And they're going to denigrate you anyways. Even if you say yes, there's still going to be plenty of people in the Western world who are going to talk shit about you and say that you're backward, you're savage, you're light years behind the civilized European nations. It's going to happen regardless. And they knew it. And they knew it. There are no real major consequences to saying no. And you can say no if you want to. This is why I'm fond of saying that Western archaeologists went into foreign countries and did expeditions when the local authorities said yes, and they were kicked out when the local authorities said no. It's that simple. The task for then the researcher, the historian, is to say, well, why did they say yes and why did they say no? And that's what I'm trying to answer in this book. That's a much more complicated question. But the actual reason, the approximate answer of why these expeditions succeeded when they did and then failed later on when they failed, was because the host authorities, the host country, said yes, then they said no. It's that simple. Okay? Also, look at the strength of China when they chose to either admit or reject foreign archaeologists. This is China in 1900, when Stein does his first expedition, when they said yes. They said yes in 1900 when they were this big and could draw on the resources of this entire huge empire. And when they were at war with the Western empires, the Boxer War, that invasion of Beijing that happened in 1900, the same year Stein gets permission. Did they give him permission because they were being invaded? No. No, they did not. Okay, so this is the context in which they say yes. When did they say no? Here, the late 1920s is when the Chinese government starts to say no. What are you looking at? You're looking at just the heartland, just the inner heartland of China. This isn't even the whole map that you just saw. This is the equivalent of like this area right here. That's it. We're zooming in on that. Even here, you don't even have a unified country. Each one of these little circles, amoebas, each one of those is a different warlord, with Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist government based at the new capital of Nanjing right here. He only has control over this. Each one of these is a different warlord. It's a patchwork quilt of warlords, not unified. Poverty racks the land. Constant civil war. This, however, is the context, the backdrop for when they say no to Stein, for when they start obstructing him. So you have, when China's larger and stronger, it says yes. When they're weaker, as weak as China's ever been in the modern era, that's when they say no, and successfully say no. Stein is obstructed, along with Hedin and along with Roy Chapman Andrews in the late 1920s. The Ottoman Empire is going to be the exact same thing. When the Ottoman Empire is united and more resourceful, they say yes over and over again. To Lord Elgin, to Giovanni Belzoni, to Heinrich Schliemann, nonstop they say yes. But it's after World War I, when the Ottoman Empire is dismembered and you have these smaller, weaker successor states, Turkey, Iraq, Egypt, that's when they start saying no and are successful at saying no. All you have to do is say no and be willing to forego some of the compensations that we'll be talking about, the compensations of cooperation. As long as you're willing to do that, you can kick them out anytime by saying no. Corruption. Were the Chinese officials bribed? Here we have Che Yuheng, the Chinese magistrate of Khotan during Stein's second expedition in 1907. This will be from 1906, with all of his Muslim begs standing behind him. A beg was a local Muslim headman or official, petty official, who often served under a Chinese magistrate. Here, Che Yuheng is the only one sitting. He's obviously in the position of authority. He also is very proud with his opium pipe, wants to be photographed with his opium pipe as well. Stein and Che Yuheng had a very chummy relationship as well. We also see Stein was very meticulous about keeping records of the Chinese officials that he met. He wanted to have very positive relationships with the Chinese officials, and we can see this. He maintained lists of officials. Here you can see on the left. Here his Chinese secretary has written down the Chinese characters for the name. Right next to it is the Chinese characters for the title, and then you have Stein's romanization from that time period of the name, and then what their title was. Li Shi Chu, the district of he wrote here Sufu. It's actually Shufu Xian, Shufu County, Li Shi Chu. And there's pages and pages of this. Is there corruption going on? Well, certainly gifts were exchanged. Gift-giving culture was very common. Okay, a pistol, French whiskey, or French wine. There's usually Russian vodka, French wine, a gift of gloves, a gift of silk from which robes would be made. These were the sorts of snuff box, a little watch. These were the sorts of things that were usually given as gifts. Never money. You will never see money exchanged. All right. Money is not exchanged for two reasons. One, we're elite educated gentlemen. That's how they perceive themselves, both Stein and the local Chinese officials. Gentlemen don't deal with crude cash. All right, we don't talk about money. It's unseemly for gentlemen like us to talk about money. Money is not exchanged. The other thing is that if you take money, it can be seen as a bribe, and a bribe can get you fired. So money, you never see money being exchanged. Sometimes the local Chinese official will actually pay for the expenses of the archaeologist and not ask for any sort of reimbursement. We do see that sometimes, in which they'll say, hey, he had used fodder for his camels, his horses, his donkeys, whatever. Let's just pick up the expense for him and not charge it for him. So we even see them going to great lengths to try to please them by assuming the costs, some part of the cost of these expeditions on their own. Then you have to ask, no doubt some of these guys were corrupt, both in their dealings with each other and with the Western archaeologist. But could every one of them have been corrupt at all times in all places? See, I asked this question, and this is one of the ways that I like to say this. Undoubtedly, there is some corruption, some coercion, and some deceit in some times in some places. No doubt. But is it really likely that there is always corruption, always deceit, and always coercion in all times and all places? Because antiquities are leaving all non-Western countries at all times in all places throughout the 19th and the early 20th century. Is it really conceivable that it's always chalked up to deceit, coercion, and corruption every time? Certainly some officials were corrupt, no doubt, but they couldn't all have been corrupt in all times and all places. That doesn't sound like a likely explanation. Then we have deceit. Here's Paul Paleo in Cave 17 at Dunhuang, the source image, the inspiration for the cover of the book. The only way to answer this question of deceit, were the locals deceived? Did they not know what the Westerners were doing? Is that why? They were just duped? And once they knew, they started to obstruct. Maybe that's the difference. Early on, the Westerners were just such cunning imperialists that they constantly deceived the poor, benighted, ignorant locals. And once the locals finally belatedly realized, oh my God, we've lost 20,000 antiquities, they started obstructing them. Is that what's going on here? Well, the only way to answer this question was to compile as many firsthand accounts of what Chinese officials saw with their own eyes as I possibly could. Both the Western diaries and Chinese sources themselves were very clear about what they showed the local Chinese officials. Here is some of the original photographs and diaries of the Paul Paleo mission from 1906 to 1908. Here is a page from Paleo's diary. This one is in French. Again, it's nice to be able to give you an idea of what these historical documents look like. You're just seeing, the typeset English translation that I've put together for this book. All these accounts, the Western unpublished diary accounts, the Chinese unpublished sources as well, make it very, very clear. And I have a big section in the introduction, read that carefully, in which I lay out every single instance I can possibly find of Stein or Paleo taking what they just got from the desert sands and showing it to the local official over and over and over again. We have Chinese letters. Here's one in Paleo's archives from the Musée Guimet in Paris. Letter from a local Chinese official to him. He has many of these as well. The Chinese letters also. This one's more of a pinkish stationary color, not quite that deep red that we saw earlier. The Chinese letters also oftentimes will explicitly refer, thank you for showing me the traces of the ancients from the Tang Dynasty. It was as if the ancients were standing right next to me. You look at that, you say, oh, well, clearly this guy saw with his own eyes the stuff that Stein or Paleo had found out in the Taklamakan or the Gobi Desert. Then remember the Chinese translation of Stein's books. Eventually, these things are all translated. The speeches they give back in Paris, the books they publish, the preliminary reports, they're translated in Chinese quite quickly usually. And then the Chinese can also see what they're taking away. And then the next time they come in, they'll say, hey, we read your book. We know what you took away. Even if they didn't see it when they were actually on the expedition trail, which they did. They already knew. But even let's just play devil's advocate. What if they didn't know? What if they were deceived on the expedition trail? Then you have to realize, well, wait a second. The Westerners went back, published books. These books were translated into Chinese. The Chinese officials read these books. Even if they were deceived once, they couldn't have been deceived twice because they read the book and they realized what they had taken away. So they couldn't repeatedly be deceived over and over and over and over again. Stein sometimes gave his books as gifts to local officials. And the books, even if it wasn't translated into Chinese, which they were, even if they weren't, so let's say they can't read the text and they don't read English, the books are lavishly illustrated with photographs of what Stein had taken away. So even if you can't read English and it's not translated in Chinese, you'll see picture after picture after picture of, oh, this is what Stein took away. And when he comes back the next time, if they didn't like it, if they were annoyed, if they were upset with him, if they thought he was a thief, surely they would have confronted him. Surely they said, hey, wait a second, page 229, look right here. You guys took this away? Come on, give it back, or I'm not going to help you again. No, we don't see that. They look at it, they say, wow, this is amazing. Look what you were able to find. What does it say? Let's translate it. And they admire him. That's what I found. Okay? So what do the sources cumulatively say about deception? That the Chinese clearly knew about almost everything. Of course, there's a few instances of deceit here and there, but not across the board. Not the majority of the time. The Chinese really weren't in the least bit deceived. Whether or not they were thrilled about it is a larger question that we'll address in a later chapter. Okay, but for now, it's sufficient to note that they generally were not deceived. That's the point I want to end with. So, coercion, deceit, and corruption doesn't work for me. I said that's apparently what all historians are positing as the explanation. And I'm not seeing this in the source base. It's not coming out. I'm seeing, in fact, the opposite. I'm seeing the opposite, and we need to explain why I'm seeing this. So I need a new explanatory framework. And the explanatory framework that I developed pretty organically over 10 years or so. I didn't start out like this. I was like, what narrative, what explanation fits the evidence that I've started to see? And I took inspiration from a couple of other major works of scholarship. One of them, and I talk about these in the introduction, one of them called How the Indians Lost Their Land by Stuart Banner, a legal scholar, a legal historian at UCLA. Brilliant scholar. He also has a wonderful book, Possessing the Pacific, in which he analyzes how many different lands that are either Pacific islands or border the Pacific, like California, Oregon, Washington, Alaska, Hawaii, New Zealand, Tonga, Fiji, how did their land actually end up in non-native hands? How did that legal process work? He does this also for North America with the Native Americans and the European settlers. And he sort of addresses, and for me, this was a revelation. He's trying to understand this, what was the non-Western understanding, the non-European understanding, like the Indians, like the Chinese, like the Muslims. What was their understanding of this strange Western practice of acquiring potentially valuable things whose ownership is unclear and for which each party has different valuations? Now, I'm looking at artifacts. Banner was looking at land, but land in a context in which the Native Americans didn't necessarily see it in the same sort of clear-cut ownership terms and property rights that the Europeans brought with them. And you can see how he addresses this question of how did the Indians lose their land. We can transport that to how did the Chinese lose their artifacts, or how did any non-Western people have artifacts removed from their country. You have to understand what is the different valuation at the time period. Clearly, the Indians could not be deceived over and over again, just as there's that deception question again. Stuart Banner was also looking at the question of, were the Indians deceived over and over again? Because there's a very denigrating explanation that says, well, they just were too dim, not very bright, and they continually were deceived over and over again by these manipulative, cunning Europeans. And Banner very clearly shows you can reconstruct the original interactions. Indians may have been deceived the first time, but you can't be deceived over and over again. You can't be deceived 500 times over 300 years. After the first time, definitely after the second time, you're going to know exactly what the European settlers mean by a land sale. And you're going to realize that over time, you lose this land. Even if you thought perhaps, the land was worth this, and even if I sell it, I'll continue to have hunting rights. Maybe you're thinking of land use in a different way. Maybe you were deceived that first time. But once you realize, oh, that's not what they mean by a land sale. They mean they take it, they put a fence around it, and they plant it, and I can't ever set foot in it again, or they'll shoot me. Now everyone knows what a European land sale means. You're not going to be deceived again. And he very clearly is able to show this in this book, How the Indians Lost Their Land. So the Indians knew what was meant by a European land sale. They knew the land would eventually be taken away completely, but still they had a range of incentives that did compel them to knowingly, and oftentimes more in the early days, less later on, voluntarily sell their land. Now, there's one major difference with our case study from Stuart Banner's case study with land in North America. Okay, the Indians did face the threat of military invasion increasingly in the late 19th century, not so much in the early years when it was harder and power disparity was not so great. And the cost of a colonial invasion and Indian war was much higher. Later on in the 19th century, the cost is lower and it's going to get much more brutal. However, there was a threat of military invasion that loomed over Indian land sales, or the possibility of gun-toting freelance settlers who were just going to take the land anyways and try to shoot you if you don't sell. So there were other external coercive factors that would eventually be involved, less so in the beginning, much more so later on in Indian land sales. And this will eventually turn the tide in the favor of the settlers in a way that won't occur with antiquities. With antiquities, you will conspicuously have that threat of coercion absent. It will not be there. No country invades another country because they said no to your application for an archaeological expedition. It just doesn't happen. So we can learn a lot from how the Indians lost their land. If we remove the threat of overt military invasion, then we can understand, hey, how the Chinese and the Muslims looked at the antiquities was different than we look at them now. We need to reconstruct their perspective and their range of motivations as to why they might allow the outsider to do what they want in exchange for what we're getting in return. And we have to reconstruct that. The burden is on the historian, because if we don't reconstruct the original interpretation, the original evaluation of what's being disputed or removed, and we don't understand what they think they're getting in return at the time period and whether or not they thought it was more valuable, then our only other alternative is to project backwards in time our own biases, our own understanding, which is nationalism. And that's from a later time period. And that's anachronistic, meaning that we're taking our own present day ideas and ideology and projecting it backwards in time and imagining that people in different generations thought the same way that we think today. And they simply didn't. These things change over time, and we need to understand how they change over time. So this is a huge inspiration to me, trying to make parallels between how the Indians lost their land and how the Chinese lost their treasures, and by extension, how all non-Westerners lost the cultural treasures that Westerners took from their land, minus the overt threat of a military invasion. The second major work was Ornamentalism by David Cannadine, How the British Saw Their Empire. For this, I took away the idea that class is often more important than nation. When you're trying to understand how things play out on the ground, the relationships we have, and this is actually something that we can all take a cue from in our own lives as well. We interact with people most often on the basis of class, right? We always talk about race, skin color, and physical appearance because it's very obvious. It's an easy thing to identify that someone looks superficially different on the outside. But we actually find, if you really analyze your relationships, most people bond on a class basis. That is to say, your economic level, your level of education, your salary, that is usually more important than what you superficially look like on the surface. We don't bond in terms of nations. I can tell you there are a lot of people who have an American passport who, if I got together in a room with them, I would go, oh my God, I can't get out of here fast enough. I have nothing in common with these people. We're all brainwashed from birth to think that nation is the most important thing. That's nationalism. That we have some primordial, eternal bond with all other people in our nation. That's fabricated. That's made up ideology to convince you that nation is more important than anything else. But in reality, even if we don't know it, our actual interactions in daily life are on the basis of class. I have far more in common with a German professor living in Berlin than I do with an American, postal worker in Denver, Colorado. I guarantee it. Okay? And it's the same with you as well. Think about these things in your life, the people that you bond with more. You're not bonding on the basis usually of race or nation. You bond oftentimes because you're in a similar economic class. This is what Cannadine finds for the British Empire. He says the British elites more often identified with the elites of other empires and states more often than they did with their own lower class subjects. Here's Lord Curzon, who actually was the instrumental in getting the support for Stein's first expedition to Xinjiang in 1900. He was the Viceroy of India, British India at the time. Wonderful example here. They are very proud of the tigers they've killed with the blood smeared on the ground. A wonderful picture to exemplify this transnational imperial bond. As I call this, transnational imperial bonding in the book. Okay? Lord Curzon bonds more with his class equivalent in the British Empire than he does with lower class Britons back home. Right? He bonds more with this guy than he would with a British mill worker in London. I've got quotes from Stein about this too. in which he's constantly saying shit about lower class Europeans, lower class Brits. And he is bonding with local Indian elites, local Chinese elites. That's transnational bonding. And that is the importance of class over nation. So you put these two things together, right? Class versus nation, and different valuations of a commodity, which we now view as priceless, but was viewed differently by the participants 100, 200, 300 years ago, land or antiquities. And these are the two things that inspired my new theoretical framework to explain how the non-Western world lost its treasures. Here you're seeing, again, pictures showing transnational imperial bonding at its finest in archaeological expeditions as well. So these are the people that Stein thinks he has the most in common with. And he would explicitly say that he's closer to these guys, other Chinese elites, than he would be with lower class, poor Brits, or he's actually born in Austro-Hungary, with Hungarians in Budapest. Right? Class, not nation. Now, how do we recover and evaluate the voices of everyone who engaged with the Western archaeological expedition? Key to this research project, key to this book, we have to know more than just what the Westerner says or what the Westerner thinks. We need to get Chinese voices. We need to get the voices of the locals. Now, the problem is that the locals, if you're lower class, you're often uneducated or only partially educated, and you're either unable to leave written records behind, or if you do, they don't get preserved because you don't have access to sort of the places where papers get preserved for hundreds of years. Stein has the ability to donate his papers to the Bodleian Library at Oxford before he dies, and they'll be preserved there. If you're not famous, if you're not, influential like him, the Bodleian Library is not going to take your papers. I can't just contact the Bodleian Library and say, hey, I've got all this correspondence. I think I'm really important. Do you guys want to take it? They'll say, no, get out of here. Who do you think you are? So even if they leave records, it's probably not been preserved. So how do you recover the voice of the voiceless? Well, one of the inspirations that I allude to briefly are Chinese legal court cases. Remember, my original expertise is in modern Chinese history. Matthew Sommer, Robert Hagel are two scholars in the field of Chinese history who have done a lot to look into Qing legal archives, Chinese legal archives, in which they find documents that are written by educated Chinese elites, highly educated men working for the government, usually very wealthy men. And they're able to look at these court cases, transcripts of court cases, to recover evidence of the lives and words of the locals, of poorer people, women, abused wives, right? Poor laborers, beggars, people who never had the opportunity to leave their voice in historical documents. They get preserved in these legal court cases. Now, are the Chinese elites infusing their own biases and unconscious assumptions into their representations of the lower classes? Absolutely. Absolutely they are. But we can train ourselves to sort of control, identify these unconscious biases of the elites and realize, oh, this is a denigrating gloss. It's probably not exactly as he described, because we know he has the bias of an educated Chinese elite, and he can't quite understand what's going on here in the lives of these poor beggars. And you can identify those biases, try to control for them as much as possible, and then recover the voice of the voiceless. It's not a perfect verbatim transcript of the voice of the voiceless, but it's the best we've got. It's the best we've got. And what I find in my own research, here is pages from Stein's diary, is that yes, men like Stein had their own ugly biases and racist assumptions. And they wrote about, he would write about his native assistants or the assistants he brought with him from India. And he often wrote about them in very pejorative, unkind terms. So how are we going to get at it? We say, oh, well, you're just going to say, you know what, Stein is unreliable. He's a haughty imperialist, very arrogant, looks down on everyone else. So we're just going to have to dismiss his entire diary. It's all biased, pejorative statements. No, because if we do that, we lose all possibility of recovering the voice of the voiceless. Just like those Qing legal documents. You could just say, you know what, this is all the bias and reinterpretation and censoring of the Chinese elites. We're not really getting at the voice of the voiceless, so forget about it. No, you can. You can, find those golden kernels and understand the likely voice to the extent we can recover of the locals. Here's my favorite example. I talked about this in the introduction. This is the passage from Stein's diary in which he has a confrontation with Ram Singh. Ram Singh is one of his Indian surveyors, a cartographer brought with him from the survey of India, from British India, with him into Xinjiang to map the land. Okay, Ram Singh leaves nothing behind. He's actually probably literate. He could have left documents behind, but he's not famous and influential like Stein. No one preserved his papers, if they ever existed. All we have are Stein's diary. Stein did not publish this because it's embarrassing to him. So all we have is Stein's unpublished diary. Is there anything we can recover? Here's how he talks about the confrontation with Ram Singh. It's obviously going to be very unkind to Ram Singh. Quote, had to administer specific, that's like a reprimand, had to administer specific to R.S., Ram Singh, about interference with transport and claims of survey camels. Apparently, Ram Singh is saying these camels belong to the survey of India. They're not your personal camels, so I can do with them as I want to, because we're both employed by the survey of India. That's what he's saying. Followed it up by friendly inquiry into complaints. All right, Stein portraying himself as positive as possible. I made friendly inquiries into his complaints. Probed his bitter feelings about work supposed to have been done for others' credit. That's right, he wants to slam Ram Singh. His bitter feelings about work done for other credit, supposed to have been done. Okay? He has taken Ram Singh down with every sentence. But we can look at it and say, well, this is Stein's haughty imperialist ways. Let's take out supposed. Let's take out bitter. Let's take out, friendly. And we can probably reconstruct what actually happened on terms that are more fair to Ram Singh. Residua, the results of our conversation. 2 long marches. Cooking shared with Nake. And ladders snoring. Bad quarters at somewhere, no superior pony, and too little ease and comfort. See, Stein's subtly putting them down, but we're getting a sense now of what sort of disputes, what sort of tensions exist on the expedition trail. We can't throw this away. There's golden kernels in here of, historical evidence. Has no wish to get credit, only pay and a safe return. Asked him to let me know thereafter of any discomfort at the time, and to believe in my wish to help in return for good work. See, Stein, of course, portraying himself as benevolently as possible. We can imagine in his dealings with Ram Singh, he was probably a little more haughty, a little more combative. When desired to save objections, etc., claims to be doing all that can be expected in department and special merit for saying good morning, etc. Stein's putting him down again. And then he ends with a Latin insult, because he's very elitist, of course. He wants to show off his education. Sad hominis speculo. Sad specimen of the human race. Now, you can just dismiss this as haughty imperialist denigration of people who aren't white men. Or you can say, let's identify Stein's biases, omit them, and recover the kernels that actually remain. Now we can understand, hey, these are the sort of tensions that existed on the expedition trail. Why is this useful to know? Because as we'll talk about in chapter 1, these are all workplace disputes. Yes, there was acrimony and tensions and fights and bitter feelings on archaeological expeditions. Were they about who owns the artifact? Hell no. Show me evidence of that, and I'm willing to sign on to that argument. I don't see any evidence of it. What I see are evidence of workplace disputes. I don't want to have to share my cooking with that guy. He snores at night. You forced us to march too far through the desert the other day. My pony sucks. Why does he have a better pony than I do? Hey, these aren't your camels. They belong to the survey of India. I'm allowed to take one away for my own purposes if I want, because they belong just as much to me as to you. And by the way, I know that you're going to be getting all the credit for this expedition, so why should I be bending over backwards to go out of my way to help you? You're the one who's going to get all the credit. Hey, we can actually recover a lot of Ram Singh's voice without the denigrating gloss that Stein has put into it by engaging with this unpublished diary. Okay, we'll stop there. I've gone on long enough. I hope that you'll agree with me that this is sort of a nice supplementary way of looking at these chapters. If you've read the introduction and you think, hey, I'm a little shaky on some things, that was a lot of information. I hope this is allowed to sort of bring out the major points and reinforce it. If you have not yet read it and you're going to read the introduction, I hope I've sort of set up several signposts for you. We're like, okay, I'm going to look out for this. And when I see Ram Singh, I'm not going to just sort of gloss over it. I remember, oh yeah, Ram Singh. We talked about it. I saw Stein's original transcription of his interaction with him, and we got a whole lengthy exposition of how Professor Jacobs wants us to look at this. And it'll stick in your mind much more than it would as if you were just sort of going through, you're tired, and that's the end of, of the chapter and whatnot. All right, thank you very much. And we'll be back for chapter 1, Sahibs in the Desert, in which we examine the interactions with the mostly lower class illiterate peasants who provided manual labor on these expeditions. And there's an iPad going off in the background to remind you that I'm a real person in real time with all the distractions all around me as well. All right, take care.